As trade tensions between the US and China continue to simmer, Prime Minister Loong says he hopes a planned meeting between leaders of both countries at the G20 summit will help set things in a positive direction.
Mr. Lee was speaking to the Nikkei Asian Review ahead of his visit to Japan for the summit later this week. Brandon Tanoto tells us more.
It's been described by observers as a complex relationship, and the recent Hong Kong protests are just the latest to be added to the mix. It's one of the issues leaders of the US and China are expected to discuss in Osaka. Singapore Prime Minister Hsien believes it will be difficult because Beijing will see it as a question of sovereignty. In a broader sense, Mr. Lee says building trust between US and China will have to start at the top. He suggested that they can begin by agreeing on easier issues like trade before moving to weightier ones. He said there are ways to work out practical arrangements, but both countries must discuss trade on its own, separate from the national security issues. For instance, on rules for investments and intellectual property, or dealing with a trade imbalance. The effects of the giant's trade dispute are being felt around the world. Trade and investment are declining, while jobs from vulnerable sectors are at risk. In the short term, Mr. Lee does not expect the trade tensions to lead to a global financial crisis. The long-term picture, though, is more serious. Mr. Lee says the split between technology, markets and trust is a very bad consequence, which could be even more serious than a financial crisis. Singapore's position on free trade and multilateralism has been consistent. For example, Singapore is a member of a wide-ranging trade pact called the CPTPP. It's also a strong supporter of a proposed RCEP, otherwise known as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. The deal is supposed to conclude by the end of this year, although that could now be delayed. India, which is one of the signatories, has become reluctant to open up its market. Mr. Lee says it is important to have India in the deal, as part of the original idea is to include all major economies on the western side of the Pacific. Leaving out India, he says, would be missing out a very big piece. Mr. Lee acknowledged, though, that missing the current deadline would make it progressively harder to complete the RCEP, and momentum may be lost. Turning to leadership succession on the domestic front, Mr. Lee says he will pass the baton to Deputy Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat after the next general election. He added that Mr. Heng will decide if he is to remain in cabinet after he steps down.